Last Advent, Christmas, last December, I gave a teisho on comparing the conception and birth of the Buddha, Siddhartha, Gautama, and Jesus of Nazareth. And I said that when Lent came around now, that I would do a teisho comparing the temptations of the Buddha and the Christ. We Christians, especially we Catholics, know that this past Sunday every year is the first Sunday of Lent is the Gospel of the Temptation of Jesus in the desert. And I gave a homily on that. You can find that online already. But today I'd like to especially, as I say, compare the two temptation stories. And there are a lot of similarities and some differences which are quite interesting. So the first thing is, in both cases, the stories about them were written much later. As you know, neither Jesus nor the Buddha wrote anything. As I say, they were too busy doing their thing, It was followers. And as I said in my homily, it's not likely that either Jesus or the Buddha sat down with anybody and said, okay, this is what happened when I was tempted. This is the sequence of events. And I think it was just people realizing, well, this was probably what it was, considering what life is and what the doctrine is and what the person is. So that's an interesting point already to make at the beginning. Now, with Jesus, it happened right after his baptism. So, where he received the declaration, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased, on whom my favor rests," which was a reference to the suffering servant, Isaiah 42. So there, the idea was, at his baptism, the beginning of his public ministry, already aware of who he was, no doubt, as the Son of the Father, he nonetheless received unenlightenment, so to speak, not only declaration of his identity, but his mission, that it would be, along as with the people, his own people, the Israelites to whom that passage in Isaiah originally referred, would be a suffering one, would be a servant one. So it would seem from the temptations that he was pushed by the Spirit into the desert, it says, to, like the people after the Exodus and going through the desert as a time of temptation, to metabolize what that was going to mean and to face the temptations that would imply. Now, one commentator, the Meditations on the Tarot, said, these were, if you look at the three of them, they're economic, political, and religious, as you'll see. But so that's social context. But I think they also had a personal, individual meaning for Jesus and for us as well. So this was after the so-called enlightenment that he underwent the temptations, not so much to test his relationship with his Father, that was certainly part of it, but to test how he was going to live out his calling. So that's the perspective. So, turning bread turning a stone into bread, using your powers, for yourself. Jesus multiplied the loaves later for people, not for himself. And also, you might, in a broader context, to be concerned about, your daily bread and all these other concerns, your daily life rather than the kingdom of God. Seek first the kingdom of God, and, what you're going to wear, what you're going to eat, as Jesus says later, will be given to you besides. So that's the economic part. The political part, of course, is the second temptation, according to Luke, is, seeing all the kingdoms of the world, and I will give you all this power and all this glory if you worship me, and of course that's not, worshiping some idol or some being. It's, as I said, worshiping yourself, basically, having it all self-centered and trying to gain power and wealth and fame and all of that, and that's just empty. What profit to gain the whole world? That's the political. So Jesus did not become a political figure, and just reference that the Buddha already was a political figure, and he gave that up, right? Born a prince as he was. And then the religious, of course, is the idea, okay, if you're the Son of God, so the devil's trying to get him to doubt his own or put God to the test by asking for some sign, some miracle, some flashy thing. And of course, Jesus shied away from miracles. He was always afraid, they're going to come and make him king, or he told people not to tell anybody about this, because it wasn't supposed to be flashy. It wasn't supposed to attract attention on that level. He was supposed to be the servant, the Son of Man, as he often called himself, rather than the Son of God, to be. And I'll come back to that point with the Buddha in a minute. A point about the tempter. The tempter is what we call the devil, and that is depicted as a personal being who trips you up, tries to get you to. This can be interpreted in a personal way, as we also see in the Buddha's case in a minute. But it can also be interpreted again in Meditations on the Tarot, or no, actually quoting a Buddhist commentator from some decades back. Sorry, that's with the Buddha. But the Meditations on the Tarot said this is like the basic human temptations, like kind of the spirit of humanity, and all the greed and power and the searching and all the egotism, kind of personified. All the forces personified, which has a certain consciousness to it already, according to esoteric philosophy. So whether it's like a separate spiritual being as it's depicted, or just this compilation of energies, this personification of these passions, it's a powerful force to reckon with. Mm-hmm. And notice that Jesus did not, certainly not yet, certainly not here, was not trying to start a whole new religion as eventually happened, through his followers, but simply like the people in the wilderness at first in the Exodus, having his own mission, fully certified and clarified for him. All the responses that he gives to the devil in response to the temptations, all three responses come from his own scriptures, from the book of Deuteronomy. So he's squarely within the tradition, at that point. Yeah. So those are the elements that describe what Jesus' temptation was. Now it's really interesting to compare that then with what happened with the Buddha. Now, first of all, the Buddha, this happened when he was around 35, his enlightenment. This is the time of his enlightenment, after his ascetical period and all of that stuff. And he was sitting down under the Bodhi tree. Jesus was about 30, according to the reports. So they're both early 30s, both about to begin their mission. And the temptations happened before the enlightenment, not after, as in Jesus' case, which is interesting already. So here he's going to be seated under the Bodhi tree during the night. And the temptations come. Now the temptations come from Mara, who is presented as this, pretty much a Buddhist devil, a spirit that tries to trip you up. It's very much the same thing, spirit of delusion or whatever it might be. And again, as I said a moment ago, Buddhist commentators even say, it's presented as a personal being, someone who inhabits what's called the realm of desire, below the realm of form and beyond form, the heavens that we talked about in previous teishos. So it's presented as a being in that realm of desire, but also understood by some commentators, again, in much the same way, as a personification of these energies, of the human energies, the temptations that befall human beings in general. So interesting correspondence. Even the word Mara, it's interesting. That it actually means something in Hebrew too. Psalm 95 that we recite every day traditionally at the beginning of our morning prayer is the day of temptation in the desert and the place of strife and bitterness. Mara is the word in Hebrew. So strife and bitterness. Remarkable correspondence, association of the word itself. And evoking the temptation in the desert, the desert of the spirit in the case of the Buddha. So he has three temptations also, as you may know, in this point leading up, during that night of his testing of his leading up to the enlightenment. And it is very much more on the level of the passions that might prohibit your enlightenment to begin with, but then also how you were able to live it out or not, as we'll see. So the first one is an army of demons, very much like, if you hear the temptation of St. Anthony in the desert, or even the Curie of Ars being accosted by these hostile forces. They're, depicted as, scary type demons that are there to inspire fear. And of course, they're violent as well. So there's violent attacks and fear and trying to get you to be scared out of your skin. But the Buddha is unmoved by that kind of aggressive attack, of scary beings, as we should be too. And then there's also a temptation on the other side of pleasure, of lust, of desire. Beautiful maidens coming and trying to seduce him, and that doesn't work either. Kind of like the world, the flesh, and the devil, kind of. And then this is more the diabolic temptation, where he tries to question the Buddha's worthiness. Well, who are you to try and reach enlightenment? And that's where he makes the famous gesture, the Bodhisattva mudra, it's called, that you often see in statues of the Buddha, where he's sitting there, but his right hand is touching the earth, Bodhisattva mudra, and he's calling the earth to witness that it's all connected, and that he's a member of the universe. That he's connected to the earth, and the earth, according to the poetry and the tradition, actually appears to even in a human type form to certify that the earth literally supports him in this. And that's where I wanted to refer back to the Son of Man that Jesus kept calling himself all through his ministry. It's referring to the earth again. I mean, he's connected to the earth. He's connected to the whole system. It's not just some ethereal being up there, but it's a cosmic function, including the material world, which is very, very good. So he passes, again, these three temptations that have their similarities with what Jesus went through. And then, as you know, now, according to tradition, what happened, after the temptations, but during the 3-4 hour watches of the night before the morning star appeared and he was enlightened, is that he saw the dimensions of the world, that he was coming from and facing, and that he was going to be able to teach. He saw in the first watch, according to the story, tradition, all people and the suffering and the sickness and the old age, that for what inspired him to see the suffering of the world and the noble truths. And then in the second watch of the night, he saw his own former lives, and that's part of the tradition. What it took for him to come to this point in terms of his long trajectory. And in the third watch of the night, he began to formulate, how do we get out of this? How are all these desires and functions of reality as we know it, how are they connected? How can we move beyond ego desire? How can we move beyond all these things? So beginning to formulate the rest of the noble truths. So again, we don't know, but that was all part of, not a temptation, but he began to formulate his doctrine at that point, according to the Buddha story. And there isn't really anything like that corresponding, to Jesus in Jesus' story. He just has the doctrine there. So he has the enlightenment experience as the morning star appears and the dawn appears, when he realizes connection to everything. I and the whole universe are enlightened, But then what happens, and this is a very strong tradition in Buddhism, and I first encountered it there when I was in Bodh Gaya, the place of the enlightenment in northern India. And they actually have the various places where the Buddha spent the next 7 weeks, and this is where he went without food. not just in that one night before, but like for 7 weeks, 49 days instead of the 40 days, 7 weeks of absorbing what he just experienced, metabolizing it. So this is what corresponds actually more directly to what Jesus did after the Enlightenment, absorbing the revelation and trying to see what it would mean. It also corresponds to many other people who had the same thing. St. Paul supposedly went into the desert of Arabia for a few years after he had his experience in the road to Damascus. Or Eckhart Tolle, whom you probably know, spent a couple of years on a park bench basically trying to metabolize what his experience was. So here again, it's trying to digest and see all the implications, but especially just to metabolize what the experience was. And so we spent 7 weeks, 1 week each, in a couple of very places close nearby. But in the 6th week, he actually went a few miles away and near a pond, and there was a huge torrential downpour. And this is where, according to the story, the king of the Nagas, these almost like dragon creatures, with the body of a snake and the head of a person, the Nagas, very famous figures. The king of the Nagas, Musulinda, came to shield him from the rain. So here, instead of the serpent that's the tempter in the Christian tradition, you have the serpent who is the protector during this period, and he formed a canopy with a cobra head, like a cobra head, a canopy over the Buddha as he was meditating to protect him from the torrents of rain. I meant to bring it, but I forgot. The first souvenir that I ever bought in Asia during my first trip in 2005 to Thailand was of the Buddha sitting there on a coiled cobra, and then the head of the cobra split into 7 heads over him. So it's evoking that incident in the tradition. But what it's also saying is Kundalini. The serpent energy is coming up, and in 7 chakras and the 7 heads over it. It's the integration of all those energies. So this is what I'm always saying. The dragon in the East, is a symbol of integration when all these energies are integrated, not just a symbol of the wayward energies or the inimical energies that are at work, as in the serpent tradition in the West. So that's a fascinating iconographic tale, and interpreted in an allegorical way as well. And then finally, the seventh week, according to the story, is actually a final temptation. And I only became really aware that this is where it happened. It wasn't on that first night, but this final temptation of a sort. Mara comes back and says, okay, you've got all this now. Why don't you just go into nirvana and get it over with? Para nirvana, just leave, basically die, or go into the next dimension. Which is Mara's way of saying, I don't want you spreading this doctrine around, But of course, he says, who's going to listen? The temptation, and something that Jesus could have experienced himself, probably. But the Buddha says, no, whatever. So for the next 45 years, he did spread the doctrine. He said there'll always be some people who'll listen. So thank you for to both great masters. So those are some of the interesting correspondences and contrasts between the two. But and the Buddha too, he wasn't looking to change the Hinduism, but that's what happened. But already from the start, he was doing something new. But there are comparisons and contrasts which are very interesting in both cases. Any comments or clarifications you want to ask, or questions, or reflections on those two stories? Mm-hmm.
You were saying that Jesus was enlightened during his baptism.
Well, what I meant by that is that he did get a revelation from the Father, a declaration from the Father, according to the story, um, and it was. This is what some scripture scholars and theologians have been saying for some decades now, that it might have been a real revelation to him at that moment about what his role was going to be in the world, how he was going to be the Son of God in the world, and it would be along the line of the servant who would suffer, and therefore not any earthly glory or anything like that. And that was what the temptations were about, and that was what his teaching later was. I mean, it's not impossible that he knew that long before, but I think the story kind of presents itself that way. The gospel, presents it that way, which is interesting. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Seems interesting to me too that, and I don't know what it means, that the Buddha had 45 more years.
Yes.
Died peacefully.
Right. Well,
Jesus apparently had a short life and died very violently.
Well, there are a couple of reasons. Well, it's all in, we would say, in the Christian way, it was all in God's providence. It's all in the way of the universe. But Jesus was a fiery prophet in a way that the Buddha wasn't. The Buddha was a challenging teacher, but he excited some opposition, especially from his own relatives, which Jesus seemed to do as well. But he was in a very, very volatile political situation at the time. So there was no way he was going to get away unscathed, or his mission was going to last very long. And then we can say what his death meant and all of that. Maybe we'll talk about that more in a couple of weeks, comparing the Buddha's death. But the Buddha, as you may recall, he died at a ripe old age. He ate by accident a poisoned stew, a stew that had been accidentally poisoned, and he's much like Jesus, forgive them. He quickly said to the farmer, "It's fine, don't worry about it." And that's when he left. So it wasn't exactly peaceful, but it wasn't violent the way Jesus's was either. Mm-hmm. Anyone else before we?
Just had a comment. The temptations for the Buddha were before he was enlightened.
Right.
Jesus was after. So they seem to have not all that much in common. Also, the way and the timing of how they died was very different.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have those things in common. So those things are they not important, or the things that they did have in common more important?
Well, I think the things that they do have in common are much more important. Even though there was also a period after the Enlightenment for the Buddha, and I see certain similarities in the temptations, that people face when they have a major mission in the world. Even where they contrast, I don't think it's a really violent contrast or a very stark contrast. It's kind of like a comparison, of two things that are similar, but you see the nuances of the differences, in each one. But they're very relatable. You can easily talk about both of them in the same talk, as I did. Because in both cases, what you had is someone who grappled with his or her mission in the world, discovering and honoring their true identity and spreading that to others. So.
Father, you mentioned that Buddha is sometimes protected by 7 hoods of 7 cobras.
No, one cobra, but they're split into one head with 7 heads. Yes.
7 heads.
Mm-hmm.
Why 7?
Well, as I say.
Does each hood represent something?
No, I was just saying that I think they represent the 7 chakras, 7 major chakras. But you can read up on that. But that may just be my own view, but I think that's true. Mm-hmm. And so it has more of an esoteric meaning, not just like a historical meaning. Well, it's not historical to begin with, of course, it's a myth, but that there's a deeper meaning to it.
I was wondering if they had any connection to the 7 sacraments.
No.
Thank you.
Not directly. Although you can say, why are there 7 of all these things? You can relate the 7 sacraments to the 7 chakras. I wouldn't be the first one to do that. So that'll be another talk. All right, let's do the vow.